The difference between verification and testing.
Um, so yeah, give me a second.
Well, I see there's some questions in the chat. I'll get to those after this one. Bonus question.
Um, so with verification,
What's the difference between verification and testing? In your words.
um, verification determines if the design meets its functional intent. So like if um it like meets what or does what it's required to do.
Yeah, you just read that off the slide. But I said in your own words, what's the difference? Like, how would if I said you were a test engineer instead of a verification engineer, what would be the difference in your job?
Um, uh, I don't know how to say it without using yours, but if I was a verification engineer, I guess like my day-to-day activities would be based around um checking the code or like checking the product to see if it works.
Like what do you mean by checking if it works?
Pardon?
What do you mean by checking? Like, are you in the lab and you're checking that it'll make it work, chip works, or are you
No,
at a
like
computer, or what are you doing?
confirming that the design works.
How would you be doing that? Like, are you doing
Pardon?
it on a computer, or are you doing it with a oscilloscope, or
Uh, like testing basically. Actually,
there's a big difference between verification and testing. What's the difference?
pardon?
There's a big difference by our definition between verification and testing. What's the main difference between them?
Um,
They're not the same. Testing and verification are not the same.
um, testing testing like checks if the design is fabricated properly.
Yeah. So what does that
Well,
mean? So when would you do it's fabricated properly? What does that mean in terms of like
um,
what you would be doing? How would you make sure that it was fabricated properly?
by
Would you do it
using
with your computer or would you do it in a lab?
um, I guess like with verification, you use like a verification environment. I think that's what it's called. Yeah.
Well, let's put it this: when you're in the lab and you're doing one of your labs, you're doing both verification and testing. What part is the verification and what part is the testing?
Um, verification is like after we design the code and like we see if it's like working properly.
So what? How do you do your verification of your different for your labs? Like,
Um,
say you're designing this egg timer. What's the verification part of it? How did you do that?
um, we I think we usually like run a simulation.
Yeah, you run a simulation. How do you make sure that it really worked?
Um, so when you run a simulation, um, I forgot what it's usually called, but it usually like pops up after you run the simulation, and you also get um messages to like, and you see if there's like any errors.
Yeah, that's called verification, your simulation. But how do you make sure that? How do you test your design? Like, how do you test your egg timer that it's working?
Um, to test the egg timer, you like synthesize and then implement and then generate it on the bit stream.
Generate the bit stream. Yeah. Then you download that into your chip, and then what do you do?
and then you run it.
You run it, and how do you know if it's working right?
Um, you like
You
uh,
look at it on the camera, right?
yeah,
You actually physically look to see that it's doing what you thought it was gonna do, right?
yeah.
So what's the difference between verification and testing?
Okay, so I guess with testing, like it's like physical kind of like where you can see if it's doing what it's meant to
Yeah,
do
it's
or
like
not.
after you made the part, after you've actually made it, you test it to make sure that it physically works. After you download the bit file into your FPGA, you looked at to see the timer was counting right, and if you pushed a button, it did the right thing. So it's
Yeah,
after you've made the design. Verification is before. You haven't even made the design. You're running simulations to make sure that, yeah, it's going to work right. But it's before you ever actually physically built the design.
yeah.
Okay. That was a long, painful, but got a bonus point.
Professor,
Yeah.
to summarize what you guys were talking about, can you just say that like verification is before fabrication and you're testing it using software?
You're not testing it, you're verifying it. Yeah.
Sorry, you're verifying it using software,
Yep.
and then for testing, like you're actually physically looking at the chip or whatever you designed to see
Yep.
if it does what you
See if
want.
it worked correctly. Yeah. No, mostly in the lab. Your lab happens to be virtual, but there's a physical thing that you download in. You're looking at it, and pushing buttons that make sure that it works right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we ran out of
Professor.
time. Oh, any
Sorry,
questions?
just one more question. So verification essentially, just to be here, is like creating our test benches in the program before, and then testing is generating the bitstream and loading it onto the FPGA and seeing if clicking the buttons works.
Yeah, see if it works. Like you're physically testing the design. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Just clarifying.
So
Thank you.
there's a couple of questions on the chat. Is there a difference between Verilog, System Verilog, and Syntax? System Verilog, we talked about this before, has a bunch of new features that it supports all the Verilog syntax, but it has some new added syntax. Software versus hardware also, yeah, it's 9:57. Okay, we're out of time. So anyway, that's it for today. We'll finish talking.